You know what else I wanted to talk about? American exceptionalist imperialism. The way that a lot of Americans who claim to be on the left, but I don't really think they're on the left, but they think they are, engage with American imperialism, engage with America's role on the world stage, as they call it. And I have a very good example for this from none other than the V-Man himself, Vaush. Vaush. You guys all know and love him. And I want to use this as a stepping off point to analyze this sort of thinking. So what does he have to say? Well, let's find out.
I think that if Russia attacks Ukraine, the NATO and the United States should be able to mount some kind of defense. Yes, absolutely. Appeasement doesn't work. This is not about being pro-war. History has shown time and time again that appeasement does not work as a strategy. If Russia attacks, they'll...
What history? It's weird. Like, what are you talking about here, for one? This is not, like, specifically the segment that I wanted to address, but this part is also weird. Like, I don't know, he's talking about Russia like it's Nazi Germany or something with the whole appeasement thing.
They'll just they'll get more and more. Ukraine isn't in NATO, so wouldn't that immediately escalate, though? Russia is escalating by attacking the Ukraine. Russia's not
the Ukraine.
Not a part of NATO. Who cares? Do you think it's in NATO's strategic interest for Russia to take over the Ukraine? You can't cede ground on this. Eventually, we're going to have to deal with the Russia problem. The big difference...
The Russia problem? Like, what is he talking about here, honestly? So I want to just note firstly here, he's talking about this in terms of, like, us, right? Like, us. Like the USA, NATO as entities, okay? He's specifically identifying himself with the USA as an entity and with NATO, okay? And that's very important because this is the mentality that many Americans have, where they identify themselves with a bloc, with a geopolitical bloc, which currently today is by far the world's worst imperialist bloc. What we can deduce from this is, at least on a subconscious level, people like this think that essentially Western military hegemony is a good thing, that US hegemony is a good thing. It just needs to be wielded in a good way. And for them, defending Ukraine from Russia would be a good way of utilizing this good Western military hegemony. For them, like, the problem with the US and European interventions, etc., is not so much that the US and Europe intervenes in the affairs of other countries, etc., it's that they do it sometimes in a bad way, right? Like, for them, there can be good imperialist interventions. Like, it's good for Europe and the US to maintain their hegemony, their global hegemony as military powers, as intervening powers, as essentially coercive entities on the world stage, incredibly powerful coercive entities on the world stage. But they just need to use their power for good instead of for bad. Like, there's no systemic analysis of why they do the things they do. There's no analysis of, well, maybe the very idea that they could ever do something like that is wrong because they're simply out for themselves and they don't want to do good things. That's simply like an empty justification for pursuing their own interests in a violently coercive way. They don't think about that. And for them, they think of it in a very surface level way, like, oh, we should use our military power and our coercive power as the world's top imperialist powers for good things instead of bad things. There's no systemic issues at play at all. For them, the only issue is, like, on the surface, like, well, the Iraq War was bad because it went badly, but maybe if they really did have WMDs, it would have been good. Maybe if it had been more swiftly resolved, it would have been good, rather than it being bad on the surface as well. Then, like, everything about it essentially being an imperialist venture, like the world's #1 imperialist military power imposing their will on another country. Even if the justification for it had been correct, it still would have been wrong. But for these people, like, they think of the US as, like, sort of like a blundering oaf that does bad things by accident while having good intentions. But the problem is the fact that the US does things to other countries in the first place.
The difference between Russia and China is that China politically benefits from global stability and Russia doesn't. We often lump Russia and China into the same...
You see how he's talking about Russia and China here, right? He's not talking about the US. He's not doing, like, a comparison of, 3 different powers, 3 different geopolitical blocks. He's talking about Russia and China in the terms of, like, their threat that they pose to Western US-led hegemony. He's looking at this as a US imperialist. He's not opposing this from, like, a neutral perspective, comparing these 3 powers. He's specifically talking about China and Russia from the perspective of someone who is, like, fundamentally aligned with the US NATO bloc. This is a trap that many American leftists fall into. Most of them have this sort of mentality, or at least I don't think they're leftists, but they call themselves leftists. So number one thing is like, get over this American exceptionalist mentality where you are very concerned with the US acting upon other countries, the sort of foreign policy mentality where like, it's a question of like, what should the US do to other countries? To what degree should it intervene in other countries? Why should it intervene in other countries? To what degree should it impose its will on other countries? That is fundamentally the way that Vaush and that many other people approach how they think about geopolitics. And that is the issue at hand here.
Groups, but they have very different strategies. China attempts world relevance by building trade relations and investing in developing countries and building strong infrastructure.
What does the US do though, right? Like if he continued logically here and he talked more and he compared China's strategy to America's strategy, we would obviously have a bit of a disconnect there. But he's not talking about this, I guess, an honest comparison of imperial powers, right? What he's talking about here is like from the perspective from what I just said, like the perspective of someone who is looking at this as like a US foreign policy analyst would. So I'm a line of the US bloc. I'm like assessing the threat of our rivals, China and Russia, and talking about how we should approach dealing with them, right? This is an incredibly sort of liberal international relations, geopolitical sort of way of looking at the world, very American exceptionalist way of looking at the world, not even remotely approaching this from like an internationalist leftist perspective. Yeah, he's coming at this like from the perspective of like the imperialist ruling class more than anything else.
Domestically and around the world in order to facilitate its growth into a first world nation. Russia is a hollowed out shit pit filled with oligarchs. They are not economically stable. They're not going to be
Wow. Filled with oligarchs. Like, another thing is this racist application of the word oligarchs. The word oligarchs is applied to American enemy countries. It's not applied to America itself. If you think Russia is controlled by oligarchs, look at the fucking USA, man. The USA is also controlled by oligarchs. The biggest ones in the entire world. Fucking Bezos, for one. Zuckerberg. Those people are oligarchs, make no mistake. Again, there's no introspection here. This is about approaching how the USA should intervene in and act upon the rest of and engage with the rest of the world. That's the way that he approaches this from. Because he is an American, he's fundamentally, subconsciously at the very least decided to align himself with the American global interests, with the American geopolitical bloc, with American exceptionalism. This is not how you should think about things. You should think about things from a more neutral perspective, like an internationalist perspective. Don't talk about Russia and China in terms of like what we should do to them. Approach it more neutrally from the perspective of like, well, the USA, Russia, China, compare how these three different countries operate geopolitically, internationally, but not from like the perspective of like, and that is why we should act upon these other or my bloc should act upon this other bloc, rather in a more neutral internationalist sort of way. Okay, you're going to see that he does exactly what I just said. That he proposes intervening in Russia.
Economically stable. They don't care about economic stability. What they care about is creating a series of buffer states by destabilizing democracies around them, which is why they have such an aggressive intelligence doctrine when it comes to promoting disinfo in other countries.
Apply any of this to the USA. Like the US, you think fucking Russia does aggressive intelligence disinformation? You think Russia tries to create buffer states or whatever? Man, apply this to the USA itself, which is the imperial power that he's explicitly taking the side of, that he's sort of speaking as here. It's like what you should be doing or whatever. If you're an American leftist, the number one thing that you need to be doing is, a leftist of any sort of imperial power, the number one thing that you need to be doing is disconnecting yourself from that imperial power. You shouldn't speak as like that imperial power on the world stage. Like geopolitically, this is what this country should be doing to this country or that country. You don't identify yourself with your own country. Don't identify yourself with any country. As a matter of fact, don't look at things from like this sort of foreign policy perspective, where like you see the entire world basically as like something for your country to act upon. It's fundamentally incompatible with any sort of leftist thought. But because he's looking at that from this perspective, right? So he's not including the US in his comparative analysis between China and Russia here. And he needs to not do that because that would sort of ruin the whole game, wouldn't it? His entire thesis here is basically, here's what the US should do about these countries, which he perceives as some sort of problem. But what if the US is the worst problem? Well, then the whole narrative is out the fucking window then, right? If the US is the worst problem, then it's acting upon these other countries is obviously fundamentally dishonest. It's obviously fundamentally done with the aim of maintaining its own hegemony, its own interests, etc. So he thinks about this in like terms of like he identifies himself with the US state, with NATO, with its allies, etc. And he's like, okay, what's best for us?
Russia is a country that would take the world down with it. China wouldn't. China is not going to start World War III over Taiwan. Russia might. Russia is one of those countries where I legitimately think like regime change.
Russia could not start World War III.
Might actually be a viable option.
There you go. That's what I'm talking about. He supports good imperialism, right? Theoretically, for him, like it would be possible for the US to be like the number one imperial power with total global military and economic, diplomatic hegemony, etc., and do it good. You know, it could do good interventions. It could remove dictators in a good way. It could do coups in a good way. It could invade countries in a good way. Like, you know, he speaks of Russia and China as if they are sort of objects to be controlled and disciplined when necessary obviously by the USA, which he wouldn't outright say it, but you can tell from the way he's speaking here, he sort of it's implied that he sees the USA as sort of like the world police, right? So the USA would be the ones in charge of keeping China and Russia in line. So the US for him, like, operates outside of the standards that he's applying to these other countries, right? Because obviously it kind of needs to maintain his sort of American exceptionalist ideology here, because if you compared it, there would be no comparison. The US is far worse on the global stage. So for him, it's like a special entity, and it like operates entirely outside of the standards that he's applying to these other entities, like, you know, how cops, for example, get special powers to deal with, at least from the idealistic perspective, you know, in theory, to deal with other citizens. For him, like, the US is the creator and the enforcer of rules, essentially like the world police, right? And this is American exceptionalism. This is American exceptionalism, like, in its purest form. It's American foreign policy style thinking, which I've talked about before, where you can see basically the entire world as something to be acted upon by the USA. Essentially, where the USA is the only country that is sort of that, at least in their ideal world, would be one where the USA is the hegemon, and it keeps all the other countries of the world in line, or at least the US, Europe as a bloc. You know, it's an actor, and the other countries' role is to be acted upon. The problem is that the USA acts upon other countries in a clumsy, wrong way. It makes blunders. The problem is not like intervention itself. It's not like the fact that the world's number one imperialist power is imposing its will upon the rest of the world for selfish ends. The problem is not that, you know, these sorts of blunders and their consequences are exactly what is intended by the people who are implementing them, by the systems that result in their implementation. It's just that they're not being done badly and for good reasons. Like, for someone like Vaush, it would be impossible to overthrow Saddam Hussein in a good way, okay? How about you just don't overthrow Saddam Hussein? Because the reason why Saddam Hussein was overthrown is because the USA wanted geopolitical power in the Middle East. It's not because Saddam Hussein was an evil dictator. They wanted geopolitical power in the Middle East. They wanted access to oil resources, etc. And that doesn't fucking change. So, like, essentially the rhetoric is the exact same, or at least the rhetoric is the same. Like, we're doing this because we hate this dictator. They think, like, we just need to be honest about it, right? But the thing is, the result is the same anyway. The USA gets access to the oil. Do you think it's possible for the USA to intervene in Iraq in an honest and good way? Not really at all.
Be an imperialist if you want, but they do sleep on quite a few nukes, and they do not have the same incentives as China to maintain world stability. I think that of any country in the world, Russia is undeniably the greatest threat to global stability. Yeah, Russia...
Like, what the fuck? That is, like, incredibly American brain right there. That is absurd. Russia is the greatest threat to global stability? You're in the USA. What are you talking about? And what is this notion of stability? Stability essentially means, like, things being stable for the market, right? But yeah, the notion of stability is essentially stability for international capitalist trade. The very notion that Russia is the number one threat to global stability or to the world or whatever is so absurd, especially coming from an American. Russia is a poor country that has essentially nothing going for it geopolitically, aside from the fact that it has nukes and that it has a relatively strong army thanks to its inheritance from the Soviet era. In terms of like an economic diplomatic power, it's nothing more than like it can exert like a level of influence over its neighbors. They can't really do much else. To frame it as the number one threat to the world or whatever is so absurd, especially from an American. The number one threat to the world is the USA. That's another thing. Another example here of how what I said earlier, like Vaush conceives of the USA as like outside of these standards because it's the police, right? It is and should be the global hegemon. So it gets a pass on this because the USA, you know, it might be the most destructive country in the entire world by far, which it factually is, but it's you know the global police force, so it gets a pass on that.
Russia is dying. Yeah, it's just you understand what I'm saying,
Russia
though,
is
right?
dying,
It's really about incentive
but it's
structures.
also like
even
powerful enough to be the world's most destructive country. What?
North Korea is privileged in this respect because North Korea, if they ever behaved badly enough, would no longer benefit from implicit Chinese protection, and if they no longer benefit from implicit Chinese,
like honestly, the way that he talks about this is like exactly as like a liberal would come away from like their first ever like international relations 101 class. There's no leftism here to be seen. It's America is the world police, and that's just how we're going to talk about things. Like he takes it like for granted. That's just the fact.
protection. North Korea is gone. They're maintained as a buffer state to keep U.S. controlled, essentially, South Korea, from having a border with China. But if North Korea acts badly enough that they can no longer reasonably protect,
it's such a dumb reason to imagine why North Korea exists.
Be protected by China, North Korea is going to be gone in a year, easily. China...
Does he like think that like, okay, so if North Korea didn't have an alliance with China, that would mean that North Korea would immediately be invaded? For one, I don't think so. And for two, he's honestly trying to make it sound like he thinks that would be a good thing. Honestly, this is very revealing if you look at it from, like, if you look at this beyond like a superficial level, if you're not a liberal, basically, it's incredibly revealing.
Will make it clear to the West that they're no longer interested in defending it, and there will be a unified Korea. So North Korea knows that
North Korea wants unification. What is he talking about? They want unification. So stupid.
Acting too crazy is necessary to keep them from losing their status as a buffer state. Russia does not have that incentive. Russia is massive, hollowed out, uncoordinated, barely democratic, oligarchical. It's not.
Imagine if he ever applied this sort of analysis to the USA, but he won't, because as I said, he's approaching this from the standpoint of I'm American, I am, you know, on the side of the Western Bloc, the EU, NATO, etc. And this is what I think about how we should act upon the world, how we should view the rest of the world. For him, it's like America, the rest of the world. America's up here, like policing it as like a sort of benevolent god. And this is the way that he looks at geopolitics. It's the way that a lot of most Americans, honestly, who consider themselves on the left, think about geopolitics in this way. And you should not, okay? Don't. If you think about the rest of the world in this way, you're never ever going to be able to have anything resembling or a remotely good conception of it. And you're especially not going to be an ally to the rest of the world.
The incentive structures are simply not the same. Yeah, NATO already has troops in Ukraine. Vaush, hang on, why is Russia more of a threat than China? Because geopolitically, China benefits from stability and Russia benefits from instability. Because Russia has a massive nuclear arsenal, very little internal discipline or cohesion, and not
internal discipline and cohesion. What the fuck does that mean?
Much incentive to maintain good relationships with countries outside of its immediate, periphery.
This is incoherent.
China has fucks to give. Russia's dooming. Okay, basically, China is like on its Sigma grind set, and Russia is like the doomer standing on top of a roof, holding a gun, like wondering whether they want to fall or shoot themselves. Like that's the thing, okay? Except in this analogy, the person who wants to kill themselves also has access to the world's second largest nuclear stockpile. Ooh, you know who I wish was here? Shoeonhead. I wonder what Shoeonhead would have to say about my interventionist take right there. I think that you could make a reasoned argument for what I just said.
A reasoned argument for U.S. imperialism. This guy is supposed to be an anarchist. What the fuck is going on here, honestly? But like, honestly, I didn't want to watch this clip specifically for Vaush. I rather wanted to watch it because I saw it as an excellent opportunity to sort of explain this mentality that a lot of Americans who call themselves left have, and how it's not remotely left at all, and the people who hold this mentality are not left, and they should really do some deep introspection or just admit that they're liberals, that they're liberal American exceptionalists who are for American imperial hegemony, and who fundamentally, you know, sort of by implication deny the destructiveness and the unspeakable crimes that the US empire has engaged in and continues to engage in. Because I'll tell you right now, Russia and China are not even remotely on the same level as the US. Not even close. Russia especially. Not even remotely close. And You have to hold the US as like above them to some sort of special standard where it gets to avoid the rules that and the standards that you're applying to these other empires, or in the case, Russia isn't even an empire. China, sure. Russia, no. But like, yeah, as like above them, as special, as the world police who gets to act upon them, who has like a monopoly on like global hegemony to really think in this sort of way and rationalize it. Because the second you actually look at what the US does, why it does it, how it does it, there's no comparison. Don't think like Vaush. If you think like Vaush, you're an enemy of the rest of the world. Simple.